Netflix has a new, monstrous story to tell. In 1950s Wisconsin, Ed Gein lived quietly on a decaying farm, hiding a house of horrors so gruesome it would redefine the American nightmare. Driven by isolation, psychosis, and an all-consuming obsession with his mother, he committed crimes that would haunt Hollywood for decades. The third and most harrowing installment of Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan's anthology series. Watch Monster, the Ed Gein story, October 3rd, only on Netflix.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn and welcome to How Are the podcast from Roker Report. And in the effort of not overloading the whole week with discussing how impressive we looked on the opening day of the Premier League season at the weekend in our 3-0 win over West Ham, today we have something a little bit different. And this is to highlight how the city of Sunderland in general is regenerating itself in parallel with the football club and as well as the institutions in it. Because today we have our first Sir on How Are the podcast. So it's a momentous moment for our podcast because today we're very pleased to be talking to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sunderland, which is, of course, Sir David Bell. Hello, David.
Hello, Chris. So it's the honour of a lifetime to be on the How Are the podcast, but you better not tell the king that or he might be offended.
Well, just to start off, I think, was it 2011 I read?
Yes, it was.
You were awarded that. I mean, that must be an unbelievable thing, especially for services, as you worked, in the civil service and you worked for the government and you did various roles. I mean, that must be an unbelievable honour to be said, that for services to the country, we award you this.
It was a great honour, Chris. And of course, you can imagine it was great for the family as well. I tried to get the kids to call me Sir David, but it didn't really work. So that's why here at the university, everyone just calls me David. And I always say the Sir David's good for the posh stuff, the business card, the email footer. But you're right. In all seriousness, it was great to be recognised that way. Unfortunately, at that time, my parents were still alive and we took them to celebrate on the day. So it was absolutely terrific. Although, to be honest, I went to a Glasgow Comprehensive, Chris, and as my late dad used to point out to me, no way was I the most famous graduate of that school. That honour fell to Alan Ruff, who you might remember, Partick Thistle, Celtic goalkeeper and Scottish internationalist. So I defer to Ruffy in the honours from Knightswood Secondary School in Glasgow. Yes, I mean he's probably most famous for being part of that terrible 1977 squad. Do you remember? Remember that? You might remember. You might be too young, but a number of listeners will remember. We genuinely thought we were going to win the World Cup. I mean, we genuinely thought, and this is absolutely true, and I've still got at home the front page of the Daily Record. 30,000 of us went to Hampden Park before the World Cup started. The Scotland team had a bus going round the old cinder track of Hampden Park. And we all genuinely thought this was just a dress rehearsal. So the next time we would do it, it would be the Cup, the World Cup. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid it turned out a wee bit different. Do you remember? Peru beat us in the first game. The infamous draw against Iran. Yeah. And then the Archie Gemi goal when we were almost close enough to qualify. Yeah. So I'm afraid I have to say that is still a memory that sears my consciousness.
Yeah, there was one of the World Cup songs that Scotland had that had the line, we're going to win the World Cup over there or something.
Oh, absolutely. We're on the march with Ali's army.
That was it.
Ali MacLeod, who was immortally pictured during the Iran match with his head in his hands. And I think there was a sort of, yes, Ali, the whole nation's got its head in its hands.
Yeah. Wow. And still yet to get out the group stage, I believe. But we'll leave that there. Because we're already getting into football, but we will come back to the football because just in terms of the university, obviously last week A-level results. And so I imagine it's a really, well, or maybe the back end of a really busy time for the university and kind of the students going through the clearing process and all of that.
Yeah, it's very busy time. I mean, last Thursday is obviously the most public day when students get their examination results, but we've been working up to Thursday, and then you go into clearing, which is that opportunity for students who don't yet have a place at university to find one. And then it goes on. So clearing actually doesn't close after Thursday. It goes on for a few more weeks as we're still recruiting students. But I mean, so far, so good as far as the students were recruited last week. And so we're looking forward very much to welcoming those next generations of students who are going to come to the university in the autumn.
Yeah. So your role at the university, just because there might be a few who aren't sure of the hierarchy and terminologies of universities, but you can correct me if this isn't the correct way of looking at your role. But the way I look at it is that you've got the Chancellor, which is almost a ceremonial position. And in terms of your position as Vice-Chancellor, you are essentially the CEO of the university. Would that be a good way to describe it?
You've got it exactly right. I think in the old days, the ancient days, the Chancellor was the person in charge of the university. But as chancellors had to deal with church and state, the Vice-Chancellor became the person who would run the ancient institutions. And of course, that title just stuck. So actually, my title here at Sunderland is Vice-Chancellor and Chief Executive. So effectively, your point, Chris, I am the person who's got day-to-day responsibility for running the university.
Yeah. And we were starting to talk before we started recording, but you did move up from kind of down south. But as we can hear, you're originally from Scotland and you've worked previously in the northeast. So I imagine it. You've had, I think it's 7 years in Sunderland now. I imagine, did it take long to settle in from coming up from down south?
Well, it didn't at all, Chris, because we first came up here from the south. And again, you might be surprised when you hear this accent, but we come up here from the south in 1990. So we'd moved to Essex in the mid-1980s. And indeed, our older daughter is an Essex girl. I mean, she was only there for 6 months, but she was properly an Essex girl. So we came up to Newcastle in the 1990s, and I became ultimately the Director of Education and Libraries for Newcastle City Council. Then we went back south, and I spent time as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools in charge of Ofsted, boo hiss. And actually, I remember when I got that job, my older daughter said, "Thank you, Dad. You have just become the most unpopular man in England, and we are your children." And then I became the top civil servant at the Department for Education for 6 years. So obviously still in the south. And then my first Vice-Chancellor's job was at Reading. And I was there for 7 years. And as you said, Chris, I've been here for 7 years. So the move back, and it really was a move back to the Northeast, wasn't a strange move. It felt like coming home, because the Northeast, after our first time up here, and certainly now we're back, this is home.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like, because I said before, but I live down in Sheffield and I come back fairly regularly. You've been there the last 7 years or so, and it seems like this is a really good time to live in the area. We'll get onto the footballing side, but just in general, in terms of the progress and regeneration of the city in general, you look at what's happened to the seafront, and I maybe see it a bit more because every time I come back, there seems to be something new. But you look at the regeneration of the seafront, you look at the sheepfolds, you look at, the new bridges that have been built in the last 10 years. It just seems like the city have been making huge efforts to move forward over the last 5 to 10 years.
I think that's absolutely right, and feel very lucky to be here at this moment in the city's history, because we came up in the summer of early autumn of 2018, and almost that was exactly the point that everything really started in the city. Now, there's no cause and effect there. I'm claiming no credit for any of that. But it's been remarkable. And of course, the university has also been on quite a journey over that period. We opened a new medical school in 2019. And last summer, not the summer we've just gone, but last year, 2024, our first medical school graduates came across the stage at the Stadium of Light, and many of them are now working not just in the city, but in the region. So I'm going to try and keep myself fit, Chris, because I do not want to be in the Sunderland hospital and be looked after by one of our graduates. I'd be looked after brilliantly, but just think how embarrassing that would be. But serious point, we've been developing a lot of programs, particularly on the health side. So at the same time as we're introducing medicine, we're doing physiotherapy, occupational therapy, our nursing programs were expanding. So we feel as if we've been playing an important part in that story of regeneration, but it's absolutely the case. The city now looks very different. More to do, more to happen. But, the football club's regeneration is clearly part of that. Isn't it great that we see this echoing of regeneration and renewal in the football club as we've seen in the city?
Yeah, it is amazing how often it runs in parallel with it. But specifically talking about the university, because I'm just about, I'm going to say young enough, but maybe old enough to remember it being a polytechnic. And it would have been around 1992, I think, when Sunderland were awarded city status, that it became a university there or thereabouts. Now, you're talking, 30 plus years now. Looking at the university that is kind of under your care now, what would you say kind of attracts people to come to Sunderland University? Because I imagine geography is a huge hurdle that you have to attempt to get past in order to attract people to come to Sunderland.
Well, just to pick up that polytechnic story, I'm a great advocate of the polytechnic movement, and I say actually that the University of Sunderland stands in the finest traditions of the polytechnic movement. So what do I mean by that? An institution that's totally embedded in the city, an institution that's preparing people for the jobs that the city needs, an institution that's trying to do research and other activity that's going to help solve the city and the region's problems. That was very much the tradition of the polytechnics, and we've tried very much to carry that forward. So we talk here about being a professions-facing institution. In other words, giving people opportunities to go on the right track to a career. That could be nursing, it could be paramedic science, it could be social work, it could be engineering, it could be computer science. Very much that long-standing tradition. We've grown in size, however, Chris, over that period. So now worldwide, and I don't think everyone necessarily appreciates this, worldwide we have 26,000 students who are studying for Sunderland qualifications. That includes, of course, about 13,000 here in the city, another nearly 6,000 in London, so we've got a big Macam presence in the city of London, as well as students who are studying for our qualifications overseas. And I think that speaks very much of Sunderland as a port city, always been facing towards the world, always assuming that people are coming in and going out, and many people making this their permanent home. So that's very much who we are today, with lots of very positive echoes of the past.
Yeah, well, that's it. You did talk about numbers there. It's funny, I was looking because there's roughly twice as many students enroll in universities as there were 25 years ago. And I think that looking at some numbers somewhere, there was around 3 million students enrolling last year across the board. Now, there's a lot of factors driving those numbers up, but I imagine, it's meant that kind of the role of universities has maybe evolved a little in terms of offering, and you've just touched on that, very specific types of study that are more designed to lead people into very specific careers rather than the old-fashioned generalized subjects that maybe generations gone by would have expected at universities.
One of the great advantages of the university system in this country, Chris, is we've got all different types of institutions. So the University of Oxford, University of Cambridge, these are world-leading, world-renowned institutions, and they're great for the UK. Of course, that's not the same as an institution like Sunderland, which is deeply embedded in its community and doing the kind of work that we've just been talking about. But I think there is greater attention now to the role that universities play in preparing people for the world of work. And we are quite unashamed about that. That doesn't mean to say that students don't get a brilliant education, they expand their intellectual horizons, we hope they have a good time as well. But, coming to university is a big investment. And students are thinking rightly, very carefully about how they spend their time, how they spend their money. So we do all that we can to give them the best chance of employment. And we're also a university here, Chris, that provides a range of other qualifications, so degree apprenticeships. So these are for people who are in work, who want to perhaps advance their qualifications further. We work with a huge number of employers in the manufacturing sector, the health sector, the retail sector, providing qualifications for people who are in work. And we've also got nearly 2,500 students who are studying online courses, some in the UK, some in the across the world. So I think what we are trying to do is to make as much of what we do relevant, not just to the city, but to the region, but to the country as a whole, and indeed internationally.
Yeah. And look, for full disclosure, I went to university and I wouldn't have swapped the experience for anything. I absolutely loved it. But there does seem to be a lot of articles in the media, usually at this time of year, actually, usually questioning the virtue of going off to university and gaining that sort of education. I mean, do you think potentially the importance of getting a degree has maybe been diluted slightly? And do you think it has the weight as it once did?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Chris. You often do get these concerns, and there are too many people going to university. But I often think, well, the people who say that, what they mean is too many of other people's children going to university. They would certainly want that opportunity to be available. And that's the point. University is not for everyone. And there are other great things that students, particularly teenagers, can do. They can go into the world of work, they can go apprenticeships, they can do other kinds of training. But I do think it's about opportunity. And one of the things that we say is talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't. And what we are trying to do, Chris, at this university is ensure that people who have the talent and the desire have the opportunity. And I look at so many local young people and look at some of our first graduates in medicine, students from local schools who are now going to be the people who will be looking after you and me in the future. So, yes, not for everyone, university, but I think it's really important we continue to make that opportunity available for those who've got the talent to succeed and, of course, the desire to succeed at university.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's the choice, isn't it? It's that once upon a time, not everyone had the opportunity and choice to go. So it's that giving as many people the choice and the opportunity to choose to do it if they so wish.
Well, I think of my own background, Chris. My dad was a railman all his working life. My mum really didn't go out to work until very late on. I went to a really good comprehensive school in the west of Scotland. I started my working life as a primary school teacher. And actually, in the days, as you say, decades before, even if I got to be a primary school teacher, I wouldn't necessarily have had opportunities to at least think of doing other things. Although I would say, Chris, probably the most responsible job I've ever done in my life is being a primary school teacher. Because my goodness, a class full of 8 or 9-year-olds or 5 or 6-year-olds, there's not a bigger responsibility or a greater honour to be educating the next generation.
Well, yeah, and talking about honours, I also read you were appointed by the government to be Vice Chair of Skills England back in February. And, I was reading about it, I was reading around it, and, it seems to be looking at trying to prepare the country really to be kind of tooled up with the relevant skills that the future workplace is going to need. And it seems like it's a huge drive from the government in the right direction to prepare the country for the big changes that are ahead. So it just seems like a great opportunity that you have with that, with Skills England.
Yes, I think that's right. And of course, this is not just about the skills of those who are coming into the workplace, Chris. If you look forward, say, to 2035, we know that around 70% of people who are working then are in the workplace now. So this is about tooling, retooling, skilling, upskilling, giving people opportunities to learn anew and to learn afresh. And of course, at the same time, we're all having to manage with technological change, artificial intelligence, and what's that going to do to the workplace? What's the impact going to be of an aging population? What's that going to be? What are the new industries of the future going to be like? So whilst none of us have a crystal ball to predict the future, I think planning now and giving people as much opportunity to learn new skills is really important. And that's in simple terms what Skills England is there to do. And I'm delighted to be part of it. I'm also delighted, of course, that I'm speaking from the Northeast, because I know from my experience in government, it's too easy to be London-centric and Southeast-centric. And it's very important that the voice of the Northeast of England and all the regions of England is heard in skills and skills policy, as well as it is heard in all aspects of government policy and thinking.
Yeah, and just on that point, I remember reading, I might have gotten this wrong, but there's a few local MPs involved in that as well, isn't there?
Yes, I mean, obviously we've got our Bridget Phillipson, who's the Secretary of State for Education, and it's under her department that Skills England sits. But I think most members of Parliament, wherever they are, Chris, in the country, they're really interested in the skills issue, because that's what matters to their constituents.
Yeah.
The folks, have we got the jobs we want now? How do we prepare ourselves for the future? What does it mean for our children and how they're going to adapt to the future? So skills is really everyone's business. And I'm, as I say, just delighted to be part of this national initiative on this front.
Yeah. And just because I've got we talked before we started recording that I've got children, and you did mention AI, but I imagine, the likes of Skills England, it always has one eye on that in terms of preparing the country, because I look at my kids and I think, maybe even in a decade, maybe it's impacting me, but it's going to impact the workplace and employment and what jobs are out there and what jobs are actually required. And it's a big thing when you look at children now on how to prepare them for that world.
It's already, as we know, Chris, having an impact in the workplace, isn't it? Because more and more people are using artificial intelligence to do some of the tasks that perhaps people might have done directly themselves. And of course, if you look over history, there have been these moments of very substantial technological change that have disrupted the economy and to some extent have disrupted society. So I suppose what we are trying to do in thinking about the future skills, and I talk from the university's point of view, yes, we need people to have the knowledge that they need if they're going to be a doctor or a teacher or a social worker or a computer scientist, but we can't sit here and think that those technological changes, particularly artificial intelligence, are irrelevant. So what we are trying to do is to ensure that students are utilizing that technology intelligently, because that's what they're going to be doing in the workplace, at the same time as giving them a broad base of skills that if they need to change or they need to adapt or they need to learn new skills, they're not afraid of doing so. And I think if we think across our own lifetimes, we've all had to learn and adapt and to change. And I think having that ability to do so might be the most important skill of all when we look towards the future.
I'm still glad that I experienced the world before the internet and mobile phones. I'll just put that out there. But
Well, I'm old enough to remember when I first went to Newcastle City Council, we had a typing pool. And you might be too old to remember that. And that was the case where you would write out in longhand and you would give it to the typing pool, and the typing pool would bring it back maybe 2 or 3 days later. And, heaven forbid there was a mistake, because it would have to go back into the typing pool. And I do remember the delightful woman who ran the typing pool saying to me, this is it. It'll never be the same. You people will all be back using the typing pool within a week. That is ancient history. And we have to just brace ourselves for similar sorts of changes coming in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to tell my kids the change, but I'm not sure whether they quite believe me yet. But moving slightly into the realms of football, just in terms of the club and the university and the relationship there, because obviously, there's links in terms of the buildings at the university with Sir Tom Cowie, Sir Bob Murray. We've talked to him in the past, and I think he writes a lot about it in his book. They were both former owners of the club, and they've got links to the university. And the club, you might have slightly mentioned it there, but they host graduations as well. So is that relationship something the university and the club actually work on and encourage, and they try and keep those close links?
Very much so. And as you rightly pointed out, there's been that great history, certainly over the last 4 or 5 decades, of some of the great figures of Sunderland and great figures of the football club being associated with the university. So, our campus at the Riverside is the Sir Tom Cowie campus at St. Peter. We have the Murray Health Building, where our medical school and our School of Psychology is located. These are really important links. But yes, you're right. We do keep in touch very much with the football club. I've always felt that if you have got a strong university, you want the city to be strong, and you want the other institutions of the city to be strong, including, in our case, the football club. Now, we've come to the end of a 21-year period of doing graduations, and we actually, at the Stadium of Light, and we gave the football club an honorary doctorate to recognise the moment. And as I said in my remarks at graduation, there was a perfect symmetry. The season that Sunderland, the university, came to the Stadium of Light, Sunderland were promoted, and the season we are leaving the Stadium of Light, Sunderland have been promoted. And we're leaving as very good friends. We've just thought it's now time to bring the university graduations into the city centre. So in the future, January next year, they're going to be at the fire station. And I think that all goes back to what we were saying earlier about the regeneration of the city. But we are working very closely still on all kinds of matters with the football club. We consider them great friends, and I know the club considers the university one of its great friends too.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, look, we are a football pod, so let's get into the football. And
thought you would never
already
ask,
mentioned you.
Chris.
I know. Well, you see, I want to talk about your expertise first before we get into the proper stuff. But we said you're originally from Scotland, so where did your love of football all begin?
Well, this is going to appall the die-hard Sunderland fans. I suppose I've always been a bit promiscuous when it's come to my football clubs. I've always been a huge fan of football. I played as a goalkeeper. That's what happens when you're my height. I played as a goalkeeper. But I've always been interested. So I believe it or not, I was as interested in Celtic as I became in Rangers. We moved south. And actually, the only season ticket that I've ever held in my life is with a team called Rushton and Diamonds. And I'm sure many of your listeners will remember they had this extraordinary trajectory up into the equivalent of League One. And then they, I'm afraid, crashed and burned. And sadly, like too many other football clubs in recent times, they were subject to, how shall I put it politely, not the most far-sighted ownership. And they left. And here I am in Sunderland, but now a complete fanatic for Sunderland. So I've always been interested in football. But was it Niall Quinn that said, Sunderland got under my skin? And I do absolutely recognise Sunderland getting under my skin.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, I think you've come to the perfect place, because We're a club founded by teachers, of course. We were originally the Sunderland District Teachers Association, and we started life early doors with a team full of Scots. We had all the Scottish players came down to play for us, and we've had big Scottish players over the years, like Jim Baxter and Ian Porterfield, of course, who scored that huge goal. So you probably couldn't have moved to a better place to pick a football team like that.
Been great Scottish connections, and of course there were 4 Scots, weren't there, in that 1973 Cup final. And isn't it interesting, just as a bit of a sidebar in that, you cannot imagine nowadays any FA Cup final having 4 Scots in it. I mean, and in many ways that's an indictment on Scottish football, but it's also just because of the internationalisation of the game where that happens. But yes, of course, some of the great figures have been Scots. And of course, there was some of them have been a bit, how shall I put it, edgy. I mean, one of my favourites in my time here was Aidan McGeady. But, Aidan McGeady, although he played for Ireland, as you know, he was born in Scotland. He was also a bit like Alex Neil, wasn't he? That kind of chippy Scot who, if he was interviewed, you thought was just one stupid question being asked away from nutting the interviewer. And there was just that sort of edge. And I think that's what the Scots have often brought, isn't it, in football? That kind of feisty edge. And certainly in Aidan McGeady, they had that. And of course, that period we've been talking about over more recent years, immortalised by Ross Stewart's second goal at Wembley. And he will, I'm sure, be another of those names that has a place carved in the history of Sunderland AFC.
Yeah. Well, do you remind me when you said that about McGeady, Kieran Brady is in the same mould as that, and kind of had honours for Ireland. But Alex Ray as well, players who called a spade a spade.
Absolutely. And then Jim Baxter. You talked about Jim and the podcast yesterday. Martin and his guest did a terrific job talking about the Jim Baxter era. And it's a really interesting thought, isn't it? Because it was a huge deal when Baxter came to Sunderland. He pretty much doubled his wages. He got an £11,000 signing on fee. That's the equivalent today of £200,000.
Wow.
By anyone's reckoning, that is serious money. But there's a great biography of Baxter, Chris, by the late Scottish sports journalist Ken Gallagher. And the 2 chapters in his book about Baxter's time in the North East are entitled Sunderland and the Decline Sets In, and Time Runs Out at Roker. And there must be a great sense of what could have been. Baxter was 25 when he came to Sunderland. Now, who's the modern day parallel? This is a bit like Enzo Lefebvre, who's 25 coming to Sunderland. He had won trophies with Rangers. He was a huge figure. I mean, again, modern parallel. Think Granit Xhaka. This was who Baxter was. But as the guys in the pod said on Monday, for a variety of reasons, it never quite worked out. Many of those reasons were to do with Baxter's own sad decline, but also, and this is interesting, a lot of the commentary subsequently said the problem was Baxter was too good for Sunderland, that he was such a classy player. And now that, I think, overstate the point, because actually Baxter was not as good at Sunderland as he'd ever been at Rangers. And also Sunderland had talented players. But in that biography I've mentioned, Chris, Billy Hughes actually concedes the point. Billy Hughes says that Baxter was better than the rest of us, and we just could never get quite on his wavelength. So there was something about maybe Baxter the genius, but the genius on the decline. So what a sad story, because it could have been so different for Sunderland if we'd had Baxter at his pomp here at the club.
Yeah, I was disappointed to miss that pod, but I might be giving something away. But there might be more on Jim Baxter on next week's on this week. Right. I think Kelvin's preparing for that again. But But yeah, for the man, in terms of Scottish fans, the man who kind of kept the ball up at Wembley in that famous after the 66 World
Chris, now, forever, whatever else Jim Baxter did at Sunderland, the Scots will always forgive him. Now, don't forget what happened. This was just after England won the World Cup. Scotland then beat England 3-2 at Wembley. And of course, the logic of that was Scotland became the world champions. I mean, I don't think people have quite appreciated that happened, but it did. But there's a great story from that match where Baxter was playing keepy up and Dennis Law, the late, great Dennis Law, was screaming at him because he saw that England were really on the ropes and they could have got a good, as they say in Scotland, a good doing, a right good thrashing. But Baxter, I think, was just determined to have Wembley as his sort of stage, and he toyed with the English. And it's a great moment where they're playing a sort of triangle football, and Alan Ball, remember Alan Ball, the England, feisty England player, he's running around trying to catch them and he couldn't get into the triangle. And that was just Baxter. So people always remember Baxter, the Sunderland player, giving England a right old doing.
Yeah. And but it's one thing you will hear time and time again on the On This Week podcast, what could have been, or typical Sunderland. It's, we did a big piece on Brian Clough, and that was exactly the same as
typical Sunderland. That has become such a great phrase, hasn't it? There are so many moments. I think I maybe mentioned to you previously my sort of lowest moment over the last 7 years watching Sunderland was bringing our daughter and son-in-law from Australia to the match against it was at Lincoln City, where Maguire scored 3 goals. Do you remember he ran up to Lee Johnson after scoring the first of the hat-trick and said presumably a few choice words? Another Scot, incidentally, Chris Maguire. And that was typical Sunderland. There you go. A man who did quite well for Sunderland, Maguire, but what's it happens? Sunderland get rid of him. He comes back and scores a hat-trick. So typical Sunderland. But maybe, just maybe, we might no longer be saying typical Sunderland in the old meaning. Yeah. Who knows?
Touchwood and all of that. Well, yeah, in the same type of kind of frame as that, my oldest son, was his first game was Shrewsbury at home in a 1-1 draw. So he had a rough start to supporting Sunderland, but as I keep, the beauty is in the struggle.
I mean, you think about no disrespect to some of those great names of English football, but in that League One and in those League One seasons, it was a sense of how the mighty have fallen when you watch Sunderland play those teams, all of whom presumably loved coming to the Stadium of Light. It was a Wembley equivalent. So they were going to show Sunderland up, and sadly, too many of them did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just going back to the one of the highlights of Sunderland's history, because you must have been a young football fan. You've already mentioned it with the Scots in there, with the 1973 FA Cup final. I mean, that must be an early football memory for you.
It is. Well, it's a really interesting memory because in those days, the Scottish Cup final would be televised at the same time. And the English highlights would be shown afterwards. And I'm sure there are enough listeners who know enough about football to remember the other match that was played in that famous day in May. So Rangers beat Celtic 3-2 in the Scottish Cup final in front of an extraordinary 122,000 people at Hampden. And I was just reflecting recently, Chris, you think there was nearly 250,000 people watching football in these Isles on that famous Saturday in 2 matches. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. And everyone, of course, as they still do, talk about the Jimmy Montgomery save. But I have an old-fashioned view. Goalkeepers wear green. You're not a proper goalkeeper if you wear green. And because Jimmy Montgomery became such a hero as a goalkeeper, I always thought, there you go. If you're a goalkeeper who wears green, you make those saves at Wembley in the FA Cup final. So, yes, it was a great it was a great memory. And I do remember, of course, as many people have commented, that Leeds United team were also full of some of the great Scots who were, really significant players nationally and internationally. So, well, yes, it was a great first memory, and probably one of the earliest memories I have actually of an English FA Cup final was the 73 match.
Well, funny you talked about this, the Hampden, and we talked about Wembley as well. My dad used to always tell me a story. His dad, it was a huge thing for them to do, but I think it was in the 50s, took him to Wembley to see England play Scotland. And he said it was one of the biggest educations he's ever had, seeing that Scottish following go down to Wembley. He said he said to the day, I think, he was telling me when he was quite an elderly fellow, but he said he's to his dying day, he never saw anything like what he saw. He said he saw some things, but he never saw what he saw at Wembley that day.
Well, like every other Scot across the world, I would claim to have a piece of the Wembley turf after the invasion in 1977.
Yeah.
And that's another good example of how the Scots, how shall I put it, didn't always behave themselves exactly as we might have expected them to behave themselves on a Wembley visit.
They enjoyed themselves, let's put it that way. But you've mentioned it briefly as well. It didn't take you long when you moved to Sunderland to get along to a game?
I did get to my first game. It was the beginning of October 2018, Sunderland versus Peterborough.
Halcyon days.
Halcyon days. Sunderland got off to a decent start. Madja scored. And then Maguire put us 2-1 up. And then it was an extraordinary moment of madness, you'll remember. Brian Oviedo, for some reason, the red mist descended on him, and he just chopped it down. Was it Marcus Madsen, I think it was, in Peterborough? And you just thought, what was that about?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the equaliser came from Peterborough, scored by an ex-mag, Ivan Toney, who, in a very typical Sunderland moment, had never scored for Newcastle when he was at Newcastle at all, never scored for them as a club. Comes to the Stadium of Light and scores for another team.
Typical.
And that, for me, was the beginning of our love affair with Sunderland AFC.
Well, yeah, I mean, it mustn't have taken you long to realise that actually, that things, the mood of the city and what's happening in the city is almost reflected in what's happening with the football club and how they're doing and what the result is.
I don't know if you remember, in general elections, when they're doing those debates of the leaders, they've got something called the worm on the screen that goes up and down. So when somebody says something positive, the worm shoots up, and when they say something bad, the worm shoots down. And you think you could do exactly the same for the city, dependent on the scores and fortunes of the football club. And absolutely, you could feel it here. Even at the university, when it was a good day, not all that many, when it came to the early seasons in League One, but certainly in more recent times, that sense that the fortunes of the football club are so important, and that wonderful and inextricable link between the football club. And I think that's the difference. And I've come from the west of Scotland, so I'm all about football fanaticism, but I don't think you could ever find anywhere in the country like that. I was thinking that walking to the match on Saturday, and that wonderful, iconic image of Ballard and Watson up on the walls just opposite the car park at St Mary's. What other city? I mean, where else in the country would do that? I mean, it is, and you could see everyone is just overwhelmed by it. And I think that's another illustration of just how deeply everyone feels football in Sunderland. And of course, talking of Saturday, well, we couldn't have started off better, could we? What a great result and what a great atmosphere.
Yeah, unbelievable. And obviously starting of the Premier League, because I mentioned I live in Sheffield and I've done for about 20 years. And the difference when one of those sides is in the Premier League, in terms of exposure for the city. And Sheffield, one of bigger cities in England, you'd say. But I mean, just in terms of the institution of the university, I mean, how important is it for the city and institutions in it that actually we get that exposure? And actually, Martin was saying that it was, it was on the national reports in Australia that were beating West Ham 3-0 in the Premier League. So we get exposure on a global basis when this happens. I mean, that must be a huge knock-on effect for institutions like the university.
Hugely important. When I was at the University of Reading, Chris, our Chancellor was Sir John Madejski.
Yep, yeah.
At that point, he was still the owner of Reading FC, and I bet you many of the fans there wish he'd remained the owner, given what's happened to Reading. But when Reading got promoted to the Premier League, John said, this gives the city and the university, or the town and the university, exposure to 1 billion people across the world who are going to be watching the Premier League highlights. And that's the way to think about it. It's a phenomenal marketing boost for the city. And going back to where we started about the regeneration of Sunderland, I think more and more people are going to become Sunderland curious. And they're going to say, what's really going on there? Let's go and see for ourselves when people talk about everything good that's happening in Sunderland. So I think it's just a brilliant boost. And certainly in our international markets, when we are recruiting for international students or we're recruiting for students to study our qualifications overseas, never underestimate the impact of a football club being in the Premier League. So thank you, Sunderland AFC, for all this brilliant marketing collateral that you have given us. Fantastic. And it's all for nothing.
Well, that's it. But I mean, you get along regularly. So what's kind of been your favourite games to go to and your favourite goals that you've seen at the stadium light since you've been going along?
It's interesting. Well, none of us were there, but I do remember that fantastic game when Charlie Wyke scored the 4 goals, wasn't it? I think against Doncaster. Yeah. I think it was in the COVID period. I don't think anyone was in the stadium for that match, and we must have been watching it on TV. And that was it was 4 crosses, wasn't it, from McGeady? That was just a phenomenal occasion to see, even though we all watched it. I'll tell you one of the oddest experiences I had at the Stadium of Light. Do you remember, just as COVID was subsiding, there was a period when they were allowed, the clubs were allowed 30 people in the stadium. And I was lucky to be invited to be one of those 30. And I think it was the match against Blackpool. And it was the oddest experience in my life, because we were all having to sit obviously apart up in the director's box or director's area, and you were watching a professional football match. Wow. And it just reminded you, actually, the game is nothing without the fans. I actually think we lost that night, so it was typical Sunderland. But it was a great reminder of just what fans do, and the atmosphere and the excitement. And of course, we saw it big time, didn't we, on Saturday? But that was one of those moments where you just realised what fans meant to a football club and what it meant when they weren't there in the stadium watching their team.
Yeah, well, again, they played a huge part in those playoffs that got us promoted, and you in correspondence that we've been going backwards and forwards on this. You said you were going off Rob Mason when he said the parallels with the 1897-98 season, and that.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I really enjoyed Rob Mason's history of the football club, the most recent one he's written last year. And there's a really interesting section in the book when he talks about that the beginning of the 1897-98 period. And I think this was the period just after Sunderland had won again and were really one of the predominant teams with Aston Villa. And Rob Mason makes the point that however important the players have been and however much they've written their place in the history books, the time for change comes. And I just thought, goodness, there's some echoes. Who is it? I think it was Mark Twain that said that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes.
Hmm.
And I thought maybe there's a bit of a rhyme to the beginning of this season, that the players who did a fabulous job taking Sunderland to the Premier League, not all of them, of course, as we saw, have made it into the starting 11. And just there is that point that there's moments in time when one team does something for you, but the next moment it's a different team in the end that does something new for you. So yeah, maybe a bit of a rhyming history there for Sunderland in looking at what's happened at the beginning of this season.
It's so bizarre. I this week I said exactly the same to Ian Murter, because he covered Sunderland back in the day under Peter Reid when in his first season when we got promoted. And there was fan favourites in there, like your Kevin Balls, your Craig Russells, your Richard Ords, your Martin Scotts, and we got promoted with that side. And you were desperate for those players because you'd invested in them emotionally. You wanted to see them in the Premier League.
And I think you wanted to see them, particularly if you take the most recent months, because so many of them were local lads, or had been around the club for so long, and some of them through the darkest days, through League One and beyond. Look, who knows? It's going to be a long season ahead, Chris, and I'm sure not just coming on off the bench, but perhaps starting. Many of those players, I think, will get their opportunity. But it is so competitive in the Premier League that you really do feel the strength. And that's where I think, and that's it, Grant Xhaka is a really interesting example, isn't he? As you were saying to me earlier before we began recording, as much as anything, you're buying him for his presence and his experience and his strength. And you cannot replicate the kind of Premier League, European level, top division experience somebody like that has got. And I actually think he could well be our talisman this season. He could command it for us, because I think he'll be strong enough when things do get tough, and they will get tough. He might just be the man that makes the difference.
Yeah, but we're talking about that gulf, but from what you've said, you were there at the Stadium of Light. Not a bad start, 3-0. Nobody expected that. But where does that stand? Where does that end?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, we probably shouldn't talk too much about the infamous FA Cup defeat against Newcastle United, 3 seasons ago. I was at that game, and I remember after 5 minutes thinking, the gulf between Championship football. I mean, it was in 5 minutes. I thought, oh my goodness. And I suppose that was with that memory in my mind going on Saturday, thinking, I just hope it doesn't look obvious from the beginning that the gulf is there. Now, I think we have to aim off for what was a pretty poor West Ham side, albeit one with a lot of international experienced players and a pedigree now in the Premier League for many seasons. Sunderland did not look at all as if they were imposters. They held their own in the first half. I mean, there was some of that neat passing from West Ham, but it didn't really go anywhere. But when Sunderland scored, and you could just feel the mood changing. And I think the fact that this was not a narrow 1-0 win. This was a comprehensive demolition of a Premier League experienced team. And Sunderland did it with style. And I think that should give us a lot of hope that this is a team, certainly if we take Saturday as a starting point, that could look comfortable in the Premier League. Let's hope so.
Yeah, and one thing, I mean, promoted sides don't pick up many wins, but one thing they don't do either is consecutive wins. Now, with Burnley and Brentford to follow, it's bizarre because it's almost a little pressure on to back it up, isn't it?
I feel as soon as you said that, I had a sharp intake of breath, Chris, because I can feel the words Sunderland and typical coming to the forefront of my consciousness. You thrash West Ham and then something bad happens. But no, you're right. And of course, the nightmare scenario I'm sure lots of fans had is we'd get to the early part of September with no runs on the board, as it were. We've got a win. And as many folks have pointed out, if you think of what happened to the promoted teams last season, who took forever to get a win, that must psychologically have a big impact on the players. And I would have thought for Burnley, this is a really interesting test. Because a lot of commentary over the summer, hasn't there? They haven't really prepared themselves terribly well necessarily for coming back into the Premier League. So it'll be a very interesting test to see how far ahead of the pace we are and maybe how far behind the pace that Burnley are. I mean, you beat Burnley, then you beat Brentford. Hey, top of the league again.
Absolutely. Well, those couple of hours were great when they're on Saturday when we were.
I sent that BBC picture with Isidore at the side of it. I must have sent that with a very large number of people on my contacts book.
Absolutely. And I assume you're going to regularly get along to the stadium with that? Yeah.
I hope we'll be there very regularly. We certainly, I know we're going to, we can't go to the Brentford match, but we're certainly there for the Villa match. We've got a well-known Sunderland supporter and a great football historian, Jonathan Wilson, honorary graduate of the university. And Jonathan is coming as one of our guests for that match. So that's going to be great. So great crack about football history, as well as being with Jonathan and others who I know are going to be really interested in the Sunderland victory. And of course, that Aston Villa match, talking of history, the great picture in the front of the Stadium of Light main entrance. So lots of historical echoes when Sunderland play Villa. Yeah.
Well, me and Jonathan went to the same junior school in Sunderland. And
I didn't know that. How interesting.
Last time we were talking about the outside toilets that we had to use there. So that's
I don't know if you know, Chris, but Jonathan's latest book, which will be published, I think, quite soon, is a history of the World Cup.
Oh, fantastic.
I can't wait to that because, the World Cup for all of us is, even now, although I think it's kind of lost some of its luster, but World Cup, Jonathan's a great football writer. Can't wait till that book comes out.
Yep, I've got a Rob Mason shelf and I've got a Jonathan Wilson shelf on the bookshelf, so that'll be a good addition. But yeah, that's brilliant, Sir David.
You're so kind.
It just leaves me. Well, we have to milk it because you're the first one. But it just leaves me to say we really appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us,
Chris. Great to speak to you, and thank you for the great work you do in the podcast. It's brilliant.
Good stuff. And hopefully we all enjoy the season ahead. Good stuff. And thanks again for everyone for listening. Of course, we'll have all the build up to this week's game against Burnley on the Roker Report website, or of course our daily releases on How We're the Podcast. But from us, it's bye for now.
Is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.